What to do, YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the seventh album by Cypress Hill. Basically, this album is called Till Death Do Us Part, and it came out in the spring of 2004. So Cypress Hill in the 2000s was kind of brief. I mean, albums like Stone Raiders and this one were very compact and brief and just kind of through the motions a bit. It just felt like most of the times these albums only had like one or two singles. Like I did like Stone Raiders. I reviewed that back in December. It had some hit songs on there like Low Rider, and it had another hit single that I don't remember that was pretty good. But for the most part, after Skull and Bones, Cypress Hill kind of took it a little bit easier and just didn't quite do as much. They did drop a greatest hits album in 2005, which I also reviewed recently. But for the most part, the 2000s era of Cypress Hill is just more compact. And I look at the concept of that with things that were kind of dominant in the mid 2000s, like Eminem and Exhibit and 50 Cent and Busta Rhymes and The Game and some of those type folks. It would have been interesting because there was kind of a resurgence with West Coast sound in the 2000s. The Game and like Exhibit and folks like that were kind of doing that sort of thing. So it would have been interesting to kind of see what Cypress Hill was kind of up to. I mean, they kind of tap into like some of the mid 2000s sound, but for the most part, it's just different. They were there for G Funk and like the more kind of stark productions. They were out before the Chronic, and Dr. Dre helped revolutionize things with G Funk and some of that type stuff. But I kind of look after this album, this kind of, I mean, it has some good productions on here, but it's not like a full-blown classic in terms of what Cypress Hill is normally up to. I still feel like two of Cypress Hill's absolutely best produced albums would be Cypress Hill 4 from 1998 and then Temples of Boom from 95. Both of those were more excellently produced. Those are better produced albums than this album, I would have to say. And it was kind of the same thing with Stone Raiders, and then Skull and Bones was kind of like a rock rap kind of blend. So that was kind of half and half with what it had. But I feel like this project, at least in terms of the production, this is not quite as sheer quality as far as that. It does have some clever ones on here, but this feels very like swashbuckled and a lot more just like kind of washed up in some cases. I mean, it's not to say it's a bad project, but it's just kind of a lot more just relaxed and kind of just like, considering that they're usually pretty crazed lunatics on these type albums, this is just a lot more kind of mellow and just kind of straightforward and just like a more relaxed kind of sedate kind of attitude. And there's not a ton of smoking songs on here either. There is Ganja Bust and Busted in the Hood, which are both pretty decent smoke songs, but they don't have an overabundance. The Cypress Hill of like smoke heavy type stuff is just not overtly kind of on here. They have more to say, but unfortunately these topics on here are not overtly kind of interesting. But we'll kind of get to that. It's not like this album's going to get a horrible score, but it's just kind of a more patchy album than I was expecting for kind of a prime time for Cypress Hill. I would have really thought that they would have taken 2004 by storm and kind of just had like a resurgence with all the hit 2004 albums that you had, like, you know, Eminem's Encore and the G Unit albums and Exhibit and The Game and some of those type folks, and just regular folks who were kind of dominant throughout the mid 2000s. But they kind of took a backseat to some of the trends that were going on. I mean, they had been around since the early 90s. They were around before the Chronic and that type of stuff, back when NWA was still kind of a thing in some of those type moments. But I just kind of look after it as just kind of where it really feels, I don't want to say that they took a backseat in this particular album, but it kind of almost feels like that. And I would say if they didn't take a backseat, they at least are riding shotgun this time. So it just feels like some of the trends that kind of happen are just kind of more bewildering. But we'll go ahead and talk about the singles on here. There are two of them. So like I said, just pretty brief just in that concept. But the first single is What's Your Number? This is a pretty hit song. I definitely like this single. It's just a very kind of offhanded and abstract kind of Cypress Hill single. Has very summery and reggae tinge kind of production. It's just very off the wall. I mean, it feels like a pretty good smoke song. It's definitely like a summery day on the town kind of cut, where if you're out on the town, it's just more during the daytime, being out on the town, just appreciating the sights and the sunlight and some of those type things. It's a cut for kind of being on the prowl. It's definitely a song for the ladies, for picking up women, that type of stuff, just being on the prowl. And it's just a very lush song. I feel like this is just a perfect example of something to listen to in like a bright green April day or May or June day, something like that, just appreciating some of the warm sights as far as that kind of goes. This is very abstract because you look after, this is about as close as Cypress Hill is going to get to like pop rap and just a more commercial kind of expression. This is very commercial for Cypress Hill. It's just surprising that they did. It's just one of the more abstract songs I think I've really ever heard from them. But it is but it is a pretty quality hit. This is probably one of the best songs on here. If you're looking for another song like this, there isn't one. This is about like this being a commercial song. They do it, but it's just very kind of like detached from the rest of the album. I mean, there is some reggae tinge type stuff on here, but in terms of like full blown commercial expression, there's just not any other songs that break out and kind of have that commercial kind of like star power. And I think that's this kind of thing. But it is a hit. It's a pretty good highlight. Definitely like the kind of summery, lazy day kind of vibes about it. It's a summer song, but it's not a full blown smoking song. I mean, I think you can smoke to it, but it's not the main mantra of the song, I would have to say. So that's just kind of the thing. Latin Thugs is the second single, and this came out later on in 2004. This is a Latin tinge kind of dance and party cut. Just some good evening festivities, and has a nice jive towards it. Definitely like this one. Tego Calderon is on here, who I reviewed in the past a little bit. It's good to get all three of these folks on here. Send Dog, Be Real, and Tego Calderon do a good job with this. This is just a very Latin-induced kind of one. It's one that is not, it's less reggae tinge. It's not this one is not reggae tinge like What's Your Number, but it's just kind of another abstract one for Cypress Hill, just because it's just more kind of certain culture more so than like a typical kind of just like club bop or something like that. So I do like the Latin infusion with this particular song. It's pretty awesome to kind of get. I would have liked another song like this. I would have definitely said this would have been another highlight to have gotten, but this is just kind of I mean, both the songs on here that are singles are just kind of distant and just detached from the rest of the album. I mean, another song like this would have been pretty good. There's one that's kind of similar to this, like Latin Lingo off of the first Cypress Hill album, but that was the only song like that on Cypress Hill 91. So it's kind of the concept that they do occasionally do it. This is just a very good dance and party cut. I feel like the vibes on here are just very thrilling, something that you could, I mean, once again, I don't feel like this is like an overt kind of smoke tune. It's definitely one for just having some drinks. I can definitely see there being some beers, cervezas kind of there and that type of stuff as far as that kind of goes. Definitely some women dancing, winding, that type of stuff as far as it kind of goes. Just a great barbecue and kind of cookout kind of cut and summer highlight as far as that kind of is concerned. But there's just not too many songs like it. They really, this is, like I said, this is a pretty mellow album. I just look at the concept behind it. There's not an overt amounts of just like cutting loose kind of songs. They do have a couple smoking songs, but it's kind of trite, I just would have to say. That's kind of the brief promotion of this project. So that's kind of the brief promotion of this project. And then after this album, they took a pretty much 6 year break between that and 2010's Rise Up. So they really didn't do much of anything in the 2000s, which I'm kind of curious as to why that kind of happened. Because I probably could have used a Cypress Hill album in 2007, 2008. I know Be Real dropped a solo album in 2009. That's kind of the thing. So out of 13 songs on here, there's 3 skits that were kind of instrumentals and stuff like that, but I didn't find those interesting. But just to kind of talk about like the 13 songs on here, I wound up recommending to you 7. So I'll go ahead and recommend those 7 songs. They would be the 7 songs would be What's Your Number, Latin Thugs, Till Death Comes, Ganja Bus, Never Know, Once Again, and Till Death Do Us Part, the title track. So the highlights on here, I feel like Till Death Comes is one of the best beats on this album. This just brings it back to Temples of Boom and kind of a more haunting vibe. This has Till Death Comes is a definite highlight on here. This has one of the best beats on the album. This is a very haunting and ominous kind of creeper. It's just a good standard rap kind of gem, and it reminds me a lot of Temples of Boom. This just has a beautiful kind of haunting piano beat on here. It's just a real shrill and kind of bone-chilling kind of beat on here that just really feels pretty cold, and I just like the concept of it. They needed another song like this, but it's just good. It's because it's a taste of old Cypress Hill from the 90s. It's just kind of an odd, I mean, the concept of this album is it has a lot of like stark kind of ominous beliefs on this album. I do like the theme of that. It's not carried throughout the whole album, but it does kind of have like a theme of departure somewhat on here, and I do like the concept of Cypress Hill kind of having some ominous type tunes. It's not quite as spooky as Temples of Boom, but it gets pretty close in some senses, at least with songs like this. A good hit song on here would be Ganja Bus, and this has Damian Marley on there also. This is a pretty heavy smoking tune. This is a reggae cut. This has like a reggae tinge kind of beat. Really feels like a song that you would listen to when you're hanging out with like some real heavy smokers. This is definitely a song that if you know some people that listen to Bob Marley like 20 times a month or more, something like that, they're constantly listening to him, know all the Marleys, wearing like the Jamaican shirts and that type of stuff, just trying to grow dreadlocks, those type cats. I would definitely feel like this is a great song for hanging out with those type cats. Just a very good, hazy, real kind of billowing amounts of smoke kind of song on here. It's just a great song to have when around smokers. Just really has that kind of thumping feel. Cypress Hill is perfect for this kind of song. I forgot that Damian Marley was kind of a heavy smoker, so that's another concept about this. Is a pretty good song for that. So it's definitely classic vintage Cypress Hill from like the 90s. Never Know is another haunting song. Never Know is kind of another haunting tune that just gives like some creepy paranoia about it. It just has a very looming and ominous kind of feel. This one's just kind of a little bit shrill, a little bit kind of jivey and jittery. I definitely would have to say it just kind of has like that paranoid kind of jittery type feel about it, where maybe you're smoking and you really have like the chills or the willies or something like that. I like this concept just because Cypress Hill just really has like a very kind of like ominous kind of tone on this song, and it's just Be Real who's really on here, but it's just kind of the concept that he just sounds a little bit more stark and demonic on this song than he normally does, and it felt like he didn't sound like this kind of haunting even on Temples of Boom. So this is a real nice one, another one that's kind of similar to Temples of Boom in that sort of sense. Once again, it's kind of an out on the town bop, and this is a great song to listen to while being out and about, while blazed and glazed and that type of stuff. Definitely a good one for that. It's also a pretty solid house party song for starting a party and that type of stuff. Just a great song for kicking things off and kind of getting things in motion as far as that kind of goes. This has a kind of uppity and kind of bouncy kind of beat on here. It's not quite a dance tune, but it has enough jive towards it where you're kind of getting things started, kind of have a little bit of energy. Not quite as sedate as most of this album kind of is, but I do like the concept of just being able to say some of that. So I definitely liked. So this is another one that's just kind of out of the ordinary for Cypress Hill. I just would have to say this one had like a little bit of prolific kind of vibe about it that just is kind of interesting, just because I mean this one once again and Ganja Bus are just two kind of ones that just have like some good kind of kinetic kind of feels towards it. If you do want to have some house party and smoke sessions, these are some good ones that are not quite as just kind of dissonant as far as that kind of goes. And then Till Death Do Us Part's a real good highlight. Tell Death Do Us Part, the title track, is kind of like a nice ode to weed. This is about not so much about a person or a girlfriend or something like that, but this is just a nice weed vow, or kind of Be Real donates his time to saying that, like, yeah, I care about weed and I'll be with it till death do us part. Good track. Definitely like the concept of that. Just an interesting one because it's kind of it has like such a serious beat. It has like organs in there that you would hear at like a church when there's like like funerals and that type of stuff as far as that kind of goes. It's just a nice touch to kind of get that, but it's just very offhand and it's kind of leery. It's just kind of the concept. It's just kind of a leery tune. It's kind of the production on here is just kind of more of just abstract compared to some of the stuff. It's just kind of an oddball Cypress Hill song to have kind of gotten, but I do like the concept of just kind of the creeping kind of production. There are some creepy kind of songs on here. Like I said, this is a very, like, this is probably in the top 3 of creepiest Cypress Hill albums. I feel like Cypress Hill, Temples of Boom, and Cypress Hill 4 are a little bit creepier than this one, but this is definitely pretty close. I mean, Stone Raiders didn't do it as much, Skull and Bones didn't do it, and like like Black Sunday and and Cypress Hill 1 didn't do it as much, but this is definitely kind of one that has some tinged ones. There's definitely some concepts as far as kind of getting this kind of like discomforting, kind of disdainful, and this kind of like not so much glum, but just kind of unorganized and just kind of haunting, just for lack of a better phrase, just kind of haunting kind of beats on here. It's just kind of interesting, kind of get that. I do like the concept of Be Real having an ode to weed. It's a pretty good concept to kind of have that. I mean, he doesn't flat out say weed is like the main thing, but you can imply just by listening to the lyrics that's what it kind of is. That's this kind of thing. But to talk about some of the songs I didn't enjoy, like there's some pretty bad beats on here. Like I didn't like. There is some gangster rap type tunes on here that just don't quite work as well. I feel like Money and Another Body Drops are just pretty poor beats that just really don't capture, like at least on like Temples of Boom and Cypress Hill 4, they had better production to be able to do it. It's just odd that they had better production in the 90s than they did in the 2000s, because you would think that they would have translated to it better, but those are two bad ones. Busted in the Hood is kind of a good smoking song, but I just didn't like the lyrics in this one. It just was kind of a poor story about just like Busted in the Hood was just kind of I like the beat on Busted in the Hood. This is kind of a good smoking song, but I just didn't like the lyrics of it. It's just kind of talking about the mishaps of just being a dealer and that type of stuff, or just having problems with trying to smoke and that sort of concept. This was not an overall good one. I mean, some of the story songs on here, I feel like One Last Cigarette and Busted in the Hood just kind of have a lot more. They're just not as much of jovial and kind of more recreational type tunes. They just kind of have like the mishap and like the sauce in there that just is not quite as interesting to kind of get. Or these songs are just not, when you listen to these and you realize that they're just kind of more mishaps and just kind of foul, like negative kind of concepts as far as just like getting like a smoke session. It just doesn't quite feel as good when you're listening, when you're trying to smoke to a song where things are not quite as ornate and quite as productive and like less cat and mouse. I kind of feel like as far as that kind of goes, when you're smoking, you're listening to mishaps. It's just not quite as eventful. It makes you want to not smoke as much. So it's kind of a disappointment that Cypress Hill just didn't have some better stories lined up. That's the problem I had with One Last Cigarette, which I did like the beat on One Last Cigarette. Both the story songs, Busted in the Hood and One Last Cigarette, I like the beats on there, and they could have been good smoking songs if the lyrics would have just been more organized for something more kind of productive and just jovial, I would have said. And then I didn't like the rock rap kind of beat of Last Laugh. That one was just not quite as good. I mean, I normally Cypress Hill is pretty good at doing rock rap. They did it better on Skull and Bones and Stone Raiders, that they just weren't able to pull it off as well this time. And then songs like Street Wars, that was another clumsy one. And yeah, just stuff like that. So it's just kind of, there just were some poor productions and bad gangsta rap tunes on here that just didn't add up. And then just some poor storytelling songs that just didn't have the correct, compelling kind of vibe, that were just kind of surprising that Cypress Hill just didn't have more spark and just the ability to kind of have that jive and compellingness like they did in the 90s. It just kind of felt like it wasn't so much half-assed and kind of half-baked, but it just kind of didn't have the concept of like the sheer kind of normal execution that they had like in the 90s. And it's just surprising because you would have thought that they would have been able to translate better to these times. That's just kind of the thing. Just didn't quite pull it off as well. I mean, there are some songs on here, but the good songs on here do have the ability to pull things off, but it just still kind of feels almost like a couple shades weaker than them. It just feels like Cypress Hill is not in their prime on this album, which is really surprising because they were in their early 30s and they definitely should have had more kind of gallant kind of smoke sessions, but it just felt so lackadaisical and just kind of like they were pulling their punches, or maybe they weren't pulling their punches, but they just were not as effective. The execution was just lowered. The overall normal quality that they had just felt very slanted and just weaker. It just felt like if they were lifting like 50-pound dumbbells in the 90s, it kind of felt like they were lifting like 30-pound or even 20-pound dumbbells on this album. It just, I don't know if they just kind of weakened, and I don't want to say weakened like they suck now, but just kind of the concept where they just didn't feel as powerful this time as far as that kind of went. It just felt like maybe they were just kind of slanted back and just, I don't know, it's just kind of the concept that it just was not quite, I mean, the singles were definitely good, but these were just such abstract and kind of offhanded kind of singles. It was just kind of odd that they just didn't have like hit after hit after hit after hit. I mean, 13 songs should be nothing to really do, especially considering that they did it like 4 or 5 different times between 1991 and 2000. So it's just odd that the 2000s era albums just didn't hit heavier. But I still like these songs. I mean, What's Your Number, Latin Thugs are great songs. I do like the kind of haunting Temples of Boom type songs like Till Death Comes, Never Know, Until Death Do Us Part, and then like the kind of jivey smoking type songs like Ganja Bus and Once Again are pretty good. So it's just kind of the concept. It's just in lesser quality. They just gave you less of a fix this time. It's just odd because I can't figure out the real concept as to why they just didn't hit as heavily. So that's the thing. But I give this album a 6.25 out of 10. It's still pretty solid. It's a decent batch, but it's just not full blown knocks your socks off. And I feel like the social score I'll kind of give like a 7 out of 10 because I do like these songs on here. They do have some good jive moments, but it just doesn't have like overall. I'm surprised that they didn't want to hit up the club and that type of stuff as far as trying to do something like that. They definitely could have stood to. I would have liked to have seen like Cypress Hill on a beat like Disco Inferno or In the Club by 50 Cent or like Just Lose It by Eminem. I mean, I know that one's kind of popish, but just something that could have shown them in like an electronic kind of 2000s era club type sense like so many rappers were doing around that time. They just didn't. They just kind of skipped over the whole mid 2000s trend of rap music. But I still give it a 7 because there is some great songs in here. Not a ton of smoking songs, but good enough. And in terms of the future, I would have to say that Cypress Hill dropped an album in 2022. So there's a few more albums I have to review. I'm going to get to some of these, but this is kind of solid, but it's just kind of haphazard, I would have to say.